Right, thank you very much, Mia, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to Charity Fraud Awareness Week. I am genuinely very excited. This is the first event of this year's Charity Fraud Awareness Week, and it is an absolute delight to be joined by two colleagues of mine, Sophie Brown and Mark Jackson, who you will hear from shortly. So welcome to this webinar. This is about preventing fraud, which is without doubt the most important aspect of the management of fraud. And it is to do with getting the basics right. And it is being presented as part of Charity Fraud Awareness Week, which is something that brings everybody across the sector together who's involved in charity and not-for-profit to raise awareness and share good practice and best ideas in how to tackle fraud and financial crime. So we would encourage you to share this webinar and any of the other resources that we provide with all of your colleagues in your organisation and others, your networks across the sector. If you are joining us live, we would encourage you to ask some questions throughout the webinar. So questions can be submitted at any time using the Q&A box, which you'll see online. And we will try and answer as many of those as we can towards the end of the session. So please do ask your questions. So as I said, with us today, and I shall ask them to introduce themselves. So first up is Sophie. Do you want to just introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Sophie Brown and I'm a counter fraud specialist at BDO, and I've worked in the counter fraud sector for about 8 years now. I'm accredited counter fraud specialist and a certified fraud examiner, and I work with a range of clients from both public and private sectors with a main focus on charities and the education sector. And I provide proactive and reactive services such as fraud and bribery risk assessments to fraud investigations. Thanks, Tate.
Thanks very much, Sophie. And Mark?
Good morning, everybody. Mark Jackson, and I'm the head of counter fraud for Christian Aid. I worked with Christian Aid for the last 12 months or so, so relatively new to the NGO sector. My responsibilities at Christian Aid include fraud and leading on the policy development for fraud within Christian Aid, but also financial crime such as terrorist sanction work, bribery, etc. And my background is one of law enforcement, and really pleased to be here today and hope we can all have a really good webinar.
Excellent, thank you very much, Mark. So just to introduce myself, my name is Dave Carter and I am the Chair of the UK Charities Against Fraud Group. I'm also the Head of Global Counter Fraud for the British Council and a Special Advisor to the Fraud Advisory Panel, specifically around charity fraud. And like Mark, my background is in law enforcement. I've worked for the British Council for about 7 years now, and I've been in the sector for about 8. So I think it's fair to say that I have been on a journey that's run parallel to the charity sector in the management of fraud, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. But I think one of the reasons that we particularly wanted Mark to join this session is because obviously he is now starting the sort of journey into fraud management within his organisation, and we hope that it will be of interest to have sort of myself, who is sort of a few years further along, and obviously we hope very much that we can share with Mark and other colleagues some of the lessons and that we've learned along the way, and how we've tried and got things wrong and found ways to actually impact things better. So I want to make sure that we're passing this knowledge on to the wider sector in order to help you all prevent fraud in your own organisations sort of further as we go forward. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is a new sort of innovation that's been brought out by the Fraud Advisory Panel, along with colleagues at the Charity Commission, which is the Fraud Pledge, which, you know, I'm pleased to say that we as the British Council have signed up to this. I think it's fair to say that over the last 7 years, there is probably no way that we as an organisation would have been willing to sign up to something that's got the word fraud in it, because I think that there was a reluctance. Everybody's concerned about brand and reputation. We totally agree that, but it was a really good sort of coup internally to get this to be signed off, and they did so willingly. And I think that is a really good measure of the evolution of how we've managed fraud as an organisation, because previously there would have been a lot more reluctance, whereas this time it was fairly straightforward. And so I would really urge your organisations, if you haven't already, to sign up to this pledge. As you can see on the screen there, you're just basically, this is like an affirmation that you're going to confirm that you're going to do these 6 different things, which are all quite fundamental and straightforward to the management of fraud. And I'm not going to read them out because I can see that you can see them there, but they are all very important areas. And I'm absolutely delighted and quite, staggeredly impressed really, that at the moment, as of 10 a.m. today, 86 charities of all different shapes and sizes and types and natures, one of which is the British Council, has signed up to this pledge as of the beginning of this session. So I think that's absolutely tremendous, and really good work by those people behind the scenes at the Fraud Advisory Panel that have been pushing this. So it's a really important initiative. It really provides an opportunity or a stage with which you can then do further awareness raisings within your organisation. So to give you an example of that, sort of later on in this week, I'm running a number of sessions internally with my sort of wider team. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is the fraud pledge, is the fact that our sort of chief operating officer was the one that agreed that we could do this. And so effectively has, and I know having spoken to him about it, he doesn't view this as just a rubber stamping exercise. This is something that he wants to ensure that, when we sign up to the pledge, we are actually going to be doing all these things. And he quite rightly will be holding me to account for all of that. So, but I accept that challenge. And I think it is something that we should definitely be doing. It is a really excellent initiative. It is very straightforward. And it is something that I would thoroughly encourage you all to do if you get the opportunity. And just a quick reminder that if you want to ask any questions about any of this, then there is the Q&A session that is on at the bottom of the page. Okay, so first up is going to be Sophie, who I believe is going to provide us with some information about the latest survey that has been done and provide us what highlights and information that has provided. So Sophie, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Hi everyone, as per the introductions, I'm Sophie and I'm a counter-fraud specialist at BDO. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, there's been a spike in reports to action fraud, and as expected, it's still escalating. And for all of us in the past 18 months, there's been a significant shift in how we operate, adapting to ever-changing government guidance, high levels of job cuts and increased pressures on personal circumstances like never before. And considering the significant changes which charities have faced, BDO and the Fraud Advisory Panel teamed up to conduct a survey to understand the changes which charities have faced and how it's affected the fraud landscape for charities in the UK, and determine what we can do to protect charities against fraud in the near future. So for the next 5 to 10 minutes, I'll provide you an insight of the main themes and highlights that emerged from the survey, and you'll also see these on the slide now. Firstly, thank you to all of you who took the time to complete the survey. We've obtained some really useful results. So interestingly, 65% of respondents either agreed or strongly agreed that the pandemic has increased the risk of fraud to their charity, which is no surprise considering the current climate. However, it was only 53% of respondents believed that the pandemic has made it more difficult to manage the risk of fraud within their charity. Why is it that half of the respondents believe that fraud is now harder to manage, and 27% believe that it is not since the pandemic? Either way, this result has highlighted that there are disparities in how charities manage fraud risk, and we'll explore the potential reasons shortly. We also asked charities about their financial investment of fraud prevention and whether the pandemic has impacted it at all. We found that 60% of charities' investment has stayed the same, and 14% do not financially invest in fraud prevention at all. Although we understand that the pandemic has had a significant financial impact on the sector, the absence or lack of financially investing in fraud prevention can prove hugely damaging on both reputational and financial fronts. It can be said that each pound spent on fraud prevention can actually save 7. More interestingly, of those respondents who stated that they either agreed or strongly agreed that the pandemic has increased the risk of fraud to their charity, 79% of them stated that their financial investment in fraud prevention has actually stayed the same as prior to before the pandemic, therefore showing that the level of investment in fraud prevention has not subsequently been matched to reflect the new level of risk as perceived that the pandemic has brought. If we move on to the most common frauds which have been experienced by charities, the survey highlighted that the most common frauds experienced in the last 12 months were payment diversion and theft of cash or assets. And the highest perpetrator was evenly split between a staff member and someone who had no connection to the charity. Intriguingly, after the 2 highest frauds which charities have faced, there was consistent level against all other types of frauds experienced, which suggests that charities need to remain vigilant against all potential opportunities of frauds, as the fraudsters appear to be trying many methods. And there was no real trends after the 2 highest frauds that we saw. We often see in the media that it's the emphasis of external threats to organisations over internal fraud threats. However, our results have shown that staff have been the most common alleged fraudster. It's important to note that it is the minority who seek to commit fraud. However, we should keep vigilant and place the emphasis on that trust is not a control. However, the pandemic has certainly forced charities and other organisations to place more trust on staff and volunteers. So there's no time like now to shift the focus onto the controls in place to determine actually whether they are fit for purpose, whether they can be circumnavigated by human application, and whether the controls are fully understood by staff and volunteers. An assessment in these areas will reduce the reliance of trust on those people operating the controls in place at your charity. We also explored homeworking as a potential factor in increasing fraud risk, as this has been one of the biggest, if not the biggest, adaptation for workforce across the UK, forcing a lot of manual processes to become electronic and virtual. Our results found that only half of respondents thought that homeworking had increased the risks of fraud to their charity. And of particular interest, it was actually the smaller charities completing the survey with incomes of below £500,000 annually. They perceived that homeworking would not increase the risk of fraud to their charity. So considering those who experienced a fraud in the past 12 months, it was particularly positive that 82% of those charities that experienced fraud in the past 12 months took action via sanctions, redress and reporting, and in some instances, a combination of them all. This was really positive as it highlights that the sector are committed to recovering funds lost and sending out a message that fraudsters will be pursued, whether it be criminally, civilly or via disciplinary action. So in summary, what can we take away? 90% of charities were of the view that fraud was to remain at a level or increase in the near future, which is no surprise. This, coupled with the fact that fraud is the most common crime in England and Wales, means that getting the basics right are more important than ever. Ensuring that your fraud response plan and cyber response plans are not only in place and up to date, but ensure that they've been tested to ensure that they actually work should you suffer a cyber or fraud attack. And also to make sure that they're effective and fully understood by those in the key roles. Also to place focus on reviewing your fraud training for staff to ensure that it reflects the current fraud risks brought about by the pandemic and inform staff of the correct reporting routes to make certain that issues and concerns and fraud are not only reported but dealt with effectively to deter future attempts. And it will also give your charity clear insights of where the fraud hotspots may lie. Furthermore, vigilance is required at this time, as the survey has shown that fraudsters are trying a variety of fraud methods. So emphasising that if you haven't undertaken a fraud risk assessment recently, to consider performing one, to be aware of your fraud landscape at your charity. Given the high level of the results presented here, we'll be providing a detailed overview of the findings with in-depth analysis and top tips in how to protect your charity against fraud in the coming weeks. So look out for it on social media, or you can contact me or the Fraud Advisory Panel directly for more information. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Sophie. That was absolutely fascinating. I was really interested to hear about the pound spent on fraud prevention gives a £7 return. That's a really interesting and valuable statistic that I will certainly be using myself when it comes to budget management internally, and also the sort of the 50-50 internal sort of external split, because I think that there is a conception that lots of people who commit fraud against organisations are sort of somebody from outside, and the risk from within is probably underappreciated. So that was some really interesting stats. Thank you very much indeed, Sophie. Okay, so I'm going to talk about fraud prevention now, and I think that what's really important to realise is that fraud prevention is genuinely the most important thing of anything that a counter fraud team would do, and it's something that I'm fortunate that I've got a small team that's scattered around our organisation, who are based internationally, and when we have our sort of regular catch-ups, we often have to try and remind ourselves that the primary function of any counter fraud team is the prevention of fraud, and only really when you don't do that right do incidents occur. Now, obviously, it's very natural for us to be involved very much in the reactive side of things. Cases happen, we respond to them. Sometimes they're minor, sometimes they're major, and we like to make sure our response is proportionate to that. But obviously, these are things that are constantly ongoing all the time, and you'll have new cases sort of coming in almost daily. So they're always busying ourselves in that area. But we have to sort of remind ourselves that actually, if we focus our time in prevention and using Sophie's tip of a pound spent in counter fraud management saves you £7. If we can think of that as an investment of our time as well as an investment of cash, then we can actually reduce the number of cases that are coming in. So therefore, we're not spending all of our time in prevention. So I think it's a really important thing to take away from this is the primary function of any counter fraud capacity, whether you're in an organisation like the British Council and like Christian Aid, where you're fortunate enough to have a dedicated team or dedicated position, or whether you're an organisation that's much smaller and doesn't have that capacity, it should still be the primary function of the counter fraud aspect to prevent fraud from happening. And I think that prevention as a tactic is something which is very, very wide indeed. So us doing this call now will be working towards our prevention strategy, because what we're doing is we are letting our organisation know that this is something that we take seriously, and in a very nice and professional way we are creating a slight deterrent, because people know that there are consequences to their actions. And as Sophie has mentioned, certainly in my experience, I've seen it as slightly more than 50-50, but a majority or a significant number of cases that are committed against the organisations will be by your own staff. So letting people know, and I think Sophie also mentioned something about fraud awareness training. So we obviously have mandatory fraud awareness training. And what a lot of that is to do is to let people realise within the organisation that fraud is something which will not be tolerated. Zero tolerance is often quoted, but is rarely acted upon. But it is something that we need to make people realise that there is a consequence to actions, and there will be sanctions, and there will be consequences to what they do. And that may well be, in a disciplinary space, or it may be, reporting to the police and seeking sort of more redress through the legal system, be it civil or criminal. But I think that the first step in the journey of fraud prevention is an acceptance within the organisation that you have a problem with fraud. And trust me, you do. Whether you know it or not, you will have, because it is not a question of if, it is a question of when. And there are lots of sort of statistics around about this sort of threat from internal. You've heard one from Sophie today, roughly 50-50. But what is another interesting statistics around, let's look at the 50% of the people who commit fraud within the organization. They are generally people who are probably more senior, people who have probably more control. They're more trusted people. It was also mentioned earlier on that, you know, trust is not a control. But what we tend to do as a sector, trust is the sort of lubricant that gets everything done around the charity sector. We trust people, and blind trust is not a control. So it is within generally those people that have got a role that they're more trusted. They could be more senior. They could be people that have worked for the organization for a long time. They are trusted, and they are the people that are sometimes those that are committing fraud. If you were to do a simple search on the internet of news articles related to charity fraud, and you see the people that have been convicted potentially, they are often more sort of senior people. So the first sort of stage here is to actually accept the fact that fraud is an issue. So when I arrived at the British Council sort of 7 years ago, everybody was sort of very interested in my role. It was a new role. But the general comment I had was, why do we as an organisation need a head of fraud? Because we're a nice organisation. We employ nice people. We do good work in good places. Who would commit fraud against us? But that's because their perception of all of this was what was they think everybody else thought the same as them. And 99.9% of the organisation, and we employ 15,000 people, so we will have shapes and sizes of all different types of personality within those 15,000 people. So 99.9% of them are good, hardworking, honest people. Of that, there's absolutely no doubt. But you know, there are some people who will seek to take the advantage of opportunities that are sort of presented their way. And I don't want to get sort of drill too much into the fraud triangle, but ultimately there is this model that, you know, people are under pressure, maybe financial pressure, maybe other pressures. They seek opportunities. They're trusted by their line managers, and maybe not line managers as robustly as they should be. And then they sort of internalize it. They justify it to themselves. Like, well, I deserve this extra sort of perk. You know, I've been working really hard and no one's sort of appreciated me. So it's not really a fraud. I'm just getting what I'm entitled to. And that's how people sort of rationalize these different sort of activities. But I think that there has to be this acceptance across the sector that fraud is an issue, and it is, as I mentioned, and not a question of when, but it's a question of if. It's a question of when. So once you've kind of got over that issue, then you can start having a more sort of sensible sort of conversation around it, and you can start doing some awareness raising, because you're not going to suddenly convince 15,000 people that fraud is something they need to take seriously. That's a journey that you need to go on, of winning people's hearts and minds. And this is probably a really good time to talk about the importance of tone at the top, because if the senior executive team don't appear to proactively care about fraud, then, you know, why should the staff that go beneath them? And that is something that has to be sort of done all the time. And again, this fraud pledge is a really good way of facilitating that tone at the top and ensuring that that's done. And then it's just a question of making sure that that you're managing it proportionately throughout your organisation. And I've used the word proportionately a number of times in the last few minutes, and that's very deliberate, because you do a huge disservice to yourself and your organisation if you spend a disproportionate amount of time. So investigate, and I see this happening all the time in investigations. A potentially fairly minor situation is blown up into out of all proportions and becomes the biggest case in the world, when actually it shouldn't be. It should just be a straightforward business as usual, deal with it and manage it in a sensible way. Whereas then when that 1 in 10, 1 in 100 case comes along, which is more serious, that's where obviously you should be investing a lot more of your time and effort. into doing so. But I think that as my sort of 10 minutes draws to a close, I think that there is some real opportunities here to introduce some really simple and effective prevention measures that will really have a big impact. So first of all, acceptance that fraud is something that will impact your organisation, whether you like it or not, it will happen. And as opposed to being something which happens tomorrow that you haven't planned for. So what would you do if a fraud landed on your desk tomorrow? Surely it'd be better to prepare for it today than you would be to wait for it to happen and be dealing with it in a crisis situation. So a few sort of things that you would need to have is a fraud policy. You need to be able to inform your organisation what your expectations are. And a real practical benefit for that is that if anybody turns around and says, I didn't know I couldn't do it, then you have something which clearly states that they can't, and therefore you negate that defence. It's a fairly important legal position. You then need to have a fraud response plan. This is if you had a fraud land on your desk tomorrow, what would you do today to prepare for it? Doesn't need to be a complicated document, and I know that there are templates available on the Fraud Advisory Panel's website. So there's the fraud policy, fraud response plan, the mandatory training or some fraud awareness training that Sophie mentioned. Doesn't need to be long, expensive or complicated. It just needs to be, even if it's just as simple as you put together a few PowerPoint slides for your staff or for your team. It could be as simple as that, or it can be, a lot more complex as you wish. But just introducing a few sort of basic things like that will really make a significant difference. I'm going to sort of leave you with reinforcing something which Sophie mentioned earlier on about trust being not a control, and blind trust not being a control at all. And if there's one thing that I would wish for to prevent the vast majority of fraud taking place across the organisations that I've worked for and the sector as a whole, it would be to replace trust with accountability. Where you have line managers who are trusting that their staff are doing or not doing certain things is a problem. And there's no issue with an appropriate level of line management. People think that might be a bit controversial, it might be a bit over the top, but it isn't. We see with almost every case that we have coming in that they have taken advantage of a line manager's faith in them, and when it eventually comes to light, there is often that element at play. So the final sort of prevention tip I would give you is to replace trust with accountability, and you'll go a long way to prevent fraud in your organisation. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is hand over to Mark, who is going to talk about the management of fraud from a prevention perspective within his own organisation, and tell you a little bit about the journey that he has been on recently. So Mark, over to you, my friend.
Okay, thanks for that, Dave. So good morning, everybody. And I think it's a really interesting opportunity here to sort of compare and contrast between different stages of development and different organizations' approach to fraud awareness, etc. So one of the many things that I picked out of Dave's comments was his global team. I think that's a very interesting description. To contrast with that, I have no resources. So I have no team, and my role when I was recruited into it was a new post. So I don't have any dedicated assets, resources, trained capability to respond to fraud reports, fraud allegations. So I guess what we'll start with is just some of the challenges that I have been grappling with, which may resonate with the context that some of you may well work within. So yeah, no resources, but all the reports that I have seen that have been reported all take place overseas. They all take place in other contexts. And therefore, one of the challenges that immediately emerges is a requirement to negotiate with local management to try and identify appropriate people, because there will be a requirement to lead on some aspects of reports of fraud on the ground. So how do you provide support to those people and assist them to conduct a thorough, and again, picking up on one of Dave's key points, a proportionate investigation to keep it within the context of what they're faced with? And that undoubtedly has been challenging over the last 12 months. Undoubtedly, the pandemic has played a role in making that equally challenging. And I will come back to some of the things that I have tried to do. I think the other two other points I will touch on in terms of challenges that I have been trying to move beyond is what I describe as a investigation stroke reactive cycle. So effectively, we're dealing with what gets reported and what comes through what I describe the front door, but there is no prevention strategy, no approach to trying to get ahead of a significant curve. And then the sort of counterbalance to that is looking at our reporting rates. What do they look like? You know, each time I participate in a meeting with a country team, I can almost guarantee a question that will get asked, which ultimately will result in a fraud report following. So in terms of knowledge, awareness, and reporting, you know, it is key. And, you know, starting to think about the activity and the solutions that we have been working on over the last year, I guess I start with understanding your business and understanding your intelligence. So I have, for the first time, produced an annual fraud report, you know, just trying to be really clear about the challenges which the organisation has faced over the last year, to try and identify from within those 12 monthly reports, what are the key themes, what are the key trends? Do we start to understand the threats and the risks that we're facing? And, you know, the headlines around some of those themes are, we are undoubtedly seeing an increase in reported fraud. And alongside that, in terms of sheer numbers, what we're also seeing is an increase in complexity in terms of the frauds that are being reported. So trying to proactively respond to the key themes and trends will be the forward look that I will be utilising over the next 12 months, and trying to use that annual fraud report more proactively across the organisation. Because I guess the second sort of issue that I would touch upon is trying to ensure that fraud is not seen as a standalone. It's not the asset you get out of the cupboard and dust down when a fraud has been reported, and trying to ensure that there is a wider appreciation of the impact. Because Christian Aid works, its strategy, its unique selling point is working in the most challenging of contexts. And the Christian Aid business model is about utilising sub-implementing partners within countries. So therein builds additional risk around the opportunity for, I've heard talk of, the threats from inside, the threats from other outside third parties. Well, I'd add another threat in terms of the partners we work with overseas in some really difficult contexts. So for me, it's about trying to develop greater integration within the wider Christian Aid organisation, and how you can become part of that organisational team, getting buy-in, getting engagement, and ultimately people listening to the issues that are coming out of counter fraud and getting buy-in to those. Because this should be core business. So when we are, and I talk about we as Christian Aid, planning projects, planning new initiatives, whether it's in a particular country, an extension of an ongoing project, how do we proactively build in prevention in terms of fraud risks? How truly developed and thought through are they? Or is it a tick box exercise around a what you might describe as a generic risk assessment? And I think it's trying to get greater buy-in engagement from those people whose role it is to develop really innovative initiatives within the most complex of contexts, but building the issues around fraud and some of the issues broader than fraud, misuse of funds. We've heard descriptions of theft, etc. Awareness training, awareness appreciation of fraud. And how can that be achieved? And how do you measure effectiveness? Well, we are about to embark on our first attempt at fraud awareness training for all of our country teams, and using Charity Fraud Awareness Week as a sort of a kickstart to the organisation to deliver that first attempt at raising awareness, raising understanding of Christian Aid's fraud and misuse policy, raising awareness of the threats and risks that country teams will face, and trying to raise awareness of how matters should be reported, the various different opportunities, the different mechanisms that staff can utilise to report concerns, can report fraud, and can report other wrongdoing. So that will be done this week, but it's taken a good year to have reached this point, and will form part of a wider prevention strategy. But it'll be interesting to see how well received that is and how we will measure its effectiveness moving forwards. Training. And I come training from the perspective that, as I am the only counter-fraud person within the organisation, the vast majority of investigations will be dealt with locally. And therefore, we do not have a trained group of, call them investigators or staff members with investigation awareness. And how do we try to develop and raise the skills and awareness of those members of staff, so that when, as it will happen, matters get reported within their countries, they're able to, working alongside myself, pick up and progress those those investigations. So that for me is going to be a real challenge. And how do you keep, once they've had an input of training, how do you ensure that they remain current? How do you ensure that they remain up to date? And does one training course then equate to a trained capability? I guess time will tell within that sphere. And I guess the one area that I have been able to progress quite quickly is increasing communication around fraud and misuse issues. Like many organisations, we have our own internal communication processes, and being able to utilise that to make sure that all our staff are aware of, I guess, what I describe as the good, the bad, the ugly around fraud in terms of our organisation, about raising awareness of threats, etc. And going to my previous experience in other roles, I think in my own head, what that plan looks like moving forwards is I guess based upon national intelligence model, which I'm sure many people will have heard of, and those three pillars of intelligence, prevention, and then enforcement. And for enforcement, read investigation. And what do those three pillars look like moving forwards within Christian Aid? Might look very different to different organisations. But it gives a structure and a strategic approach to how you will develop, respond to the fraud threats which we all face. And I think at that point I will stop for breath. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. That was really interesting, and it all really resonates with me because I've sort of been on a very similar journey to the one that you are currently on. And from what I can see and hear on this call and our other communications, I think you're definitely heading in the right direction and doing a great job. But it is a difficult journey because you've got to sort of try and win all those internal comms that you just sort of spoke about. But so thank you very much, Mark. That was absolutely fascinating insight to some of the challenges that not only you're facing in your organisation, but other organisations will be facing. I think Christian Aid are very lucky to have you. So thanks very much. We'll go to Mark and then Sophie very quickly for your top tip to prevent fraud if you haven't had the opportunity yet to say it. So Mark, what would be your top tip to prevent fraud that you could pass on to our colleagues on the call?
I guess my top tip would be, it is about ensuring visibility and sort of engagement with the rest of the organisation, because prevention of fraud is not going to be solved by the head of counter fraud or whoever it is. It's going to be solved by the organisation. It's everyone's responsibility. So I guess my top tip will be, it's about visibility, engagement, and integration.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Mark. And Sophie, what's your top tip?
I guess it's on the lines that we've mentioned already, but I really would say to undertake an up-to-date fraud risk assessment, especially considering that the pandemic has now hit us, because controls have changed, people have moved to different roles, some roles may have disappeared completely. So I think it's really important that charities are aware of what their current fraud risks are, and then that hopefully stops a fraud occurring or actually makes you more aware earlier on when a fraud has occurred to stop more financial or reputational damage.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sophie. And my top tip would be to have an acceptance that fraud exists and is a problem in your organisations, whether you think it is or not. I can't begin to underplay the value of just the acceptance that it's something that you need to deal with. And it's so much easier to introduce measures to target it now than it is going to be in a live situation when you're actually got this, you've got these things going on. Fraud can cause so much upset and misery. It's not just about the financial loss. It's not even just about the reputational loss, although both of those things are obviously very significant. It's about the totally sort of debilitating nature of a fraud, and trying to deal with an organization that is, trying to do some, really good work, but has had maybe a bad apple, something's gone wrong, and the impact that has on staff morale and the ability of the organization to function for a period of time has a really big sort of impact. So please don't just assume that everything is as it should be. Please use this opportunity to try and do something about it. Okay, so I'd just like to thank Mark and Sophie very much for their time today. It's been absolutely fabulous listening to your insights. I have been told that there is a survey that we'd be very grateful for you to do, and it will pop up somewhere at some point on this presentation. So please do complete the survey if you wouldn't mind. And this webinar will be available on demand, so you can watch it again if you've not had enough fun yet this morning. And it'll be on our website, which is preventcharityfraud.org.uk, and you'll also find a whole load of other resources there, which hopefully will be of use to you. Thank you all so much for your time this morning. Mark, Sophie, thank you very much. Mia and Zoe behind the scenes, thank you as well. And we'll speak to you all again soon. All the best.